and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, and thank you for attending this afternoon's program. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SIB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy this afternoon's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at doleinstitute.org. A video of tonight's presentation will be available on our website soon. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. Finally, if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers here in the hall, and they can assist. And now, please welcome Assistant Director Barbara Ballard.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our 2014 Presidential Lecture Series. I think, as you all know, it's popular, or you all would not be sitting here. And whenever we have Richard Norton Smith, we know that you will turn out. So again, we thank you very much. Before I do the introductions, however, I would like to recognize Bob Pettit. Would you please stand?
Mike Pettit.
Oh, excuse me, Mike Pettit. I wouldn't have stood either. So I looked at it, and he's former Chief of Staff to Senator Dole and a visiting fellow here at the Dole Institute this semester. I also would just like to recognize that for this lecture series, it is sponsored in part by the William T. Kemper II Charitable Trust and Commerce Trust Company and Bob Lloyd co-trustees. I will just call your attention to the back, just so that you'll know that this is our 10th anniversary series, but tomorrow night we will have the second part of Mary and her sisters, and then on February 26th, 27th will be the last two of the presidential series, and you can see the other programs. I hope you will think about coming to study groups as well. We have a very busy semester, a very exciting semester, and I think you all know that you always have the opportunities to ask questions, so not only will you hear from the guests we bring here, but also something that perhaps they did not say, you have that opportunity to ask and to learn. With that, I will give an introduction of which Richard Norton Smith does not need an introduction. But wouldn't that be awful to say, and here he is? So I will not do that because I think he has warranted more than that. And besides, there could be some new people here who do not know who Richard Norton Smith is. And I would be remiss if I did not try to shed light on that. Richard Norton Smith has been involved in the political world since graduating magna cum laude from Harvard University. You also know that he's a freelance writer has been for the Washington Post. His first major book was Thomas E. Dewey and His Times, and that book was a finalist for the 1983 Pulitzer Prize. Since then, he's had 4 other books, and there's another book in the making. Between 1987 and 2001, he served as director of the Herbert Hoover Residential Library and Museum, the Dwight Eisenhower Center, Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. In 2002, the University of Kansas was very, very fortunate to have Richard Norton Smith become the first director of the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics, where he supervised construction of the Institute's landmark home. And I think you're all sitting in it. You know how magnificent it is and the historic value that's here as well, and about Senator Dole. I would also say in October 2003, he was appointed founding director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. I will tell you that he has a knack for working on libraries, and he leaves them in wonderful shape, and then someone else wants him to come and do something for them. Since 2006, he has been a scholar in residence at George Mason University, where he teaches courses in the American presidency. He is a frequent contributor to such publications as Life, Time, and the New York Times, and he's certainly a familiar face to viewers on C-SPAN. And you heard Director Bill Lacey say tomorrow night we will have that pleasure live with C-SPAN. With that, I simply say I will turn this program over to Bill Lacey, Director of the Dole Institute, and could we please have a warm welcome for Richard Norton Smith.
Richard, welcome back. It's great to have you here.
Have you noticed it's become sort of a President's Day tradition that along with the used appliance and car sales, I show up in Lawrence. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here.
Are you calling me a used car salesman, Richard?
It worked for Richard Nixon.
Yes, okay. A couple years ago, you said, Bill, we should do a series on the First Ladies. And we kind of held it for a couple years because I really wanted to time it with a 10th anniversary year. But what were your thoughts originally behind the series?
Well, I've been asked that in conjunction with the C-SPAN series. In some ways, there are real parallels. In some ways, forgive me for saying it, it's a no-brainer. I mean, if C-SPAN 10, 12 years ago did a landmark series on the presidents. And maybe it's a good thing we've waited this long. If anything, I think our appreciation of the challenges that First Ladies confront has grown along with the events of the last decade or so. Biographically, they're often more interesting than their husbands. They sell more books than their husbands. They have higher poll ratings than their husbands. They've evolved over 200 years into a quasi-political tightrope walking artist. The tightrope walking is 200 years, a tradition 200 years in the making. The overtly political, albeit not overtly partisan nature that surrounds the office, it's become an office, is a relatively modern institution. The institutionalization of the First Lady, the East Wing, is associated with, it's where the First Lady staff works. Well, for most of the 20th century, there was the East Wing and the West Wing, and never the twain shall meet. Even to the point where invitations for White House state dinners had to all be vetted by the political staff in the West Wing. It wasn't something for the First Lady's staff, in effect, to generate. Mrs. Hoover is the First Lady to have more than one secretary. She had 4, 3 of whom she paid out of her own funds, and the 4th, who acted in effect as a social secretary. And the reason she had 4 was because of the demands generated by the Great Depression. But it's really Rosalynn Carter, who I think it often gets overlooked, quite frankly, when we talk about First Ladies. But it's Rosalynn Carter who created the structure of the modern First Lady in terms of the staffing pattern. The fact that a First Lady, well, actually, Congress passed legislation in 1978, the first time in our history, that basically authorized public funds to be used to staff the office of the First Lady, recognizing that this has become a full-time occupation, full-time and then some. And of course, the irony is, the Constitution says very little about what the president should do. It hasn't a word about what a presidential spouse should do, and that's fine. But over 200 years, to get back to your question, there's a fascinating story of how these women, 40 roughly odd, some odd, some not, women, forged out of that void what we recognize today as the First Lady, and which is, I suspect, sooner rather than later, to be reinvented when there is a First Gentleman.
Where did the title First Lady originate?
You know, that's one of the many things that people argue over. We know, the conventional wisdom is that it originated with Mrs. Hayes in the 1870s. Lucy Hayes is much more than the Lemonade Lucy of popular memory, the doughty temperance campaigner. She was that, but she was much more. She was also referred to as, in effect, the leading example of the new woman, as defined in the 1870s, which meant mostly she went to college and she took an interest in public affairs. That was represented as new. We know that the term was thrown around. Actually, Mrs. Jefferson Davis was referred to as the First Lady of the Confederacy. It was also applied, we think, as early as Sarah Polk. So, you know, you can get a good argument going.
Okay. What were the attitudes of the early First Ladies about their role?
Well, they were all resentful. And some of them, quite frankly, to be serious, some of them really had tragic encounters with celebrity. One of the things you very quickly realize as you begin to study these lives is how much sacrifice these women made. We think of Abigail Adams as this, quintessential 18th century feminist, indomitable. And the fact is, today, probably she would be the office holder in the family. She had better political instincts than her husband. She certainly had better instincts about people than her husband. But they were a partnership. I mean, 200 years before Bill and Hillary, or Jimmy and Rosalind, or Franklin and Eleanor. One reason why the Adamses, I think, have come down to us in such a vivid light is because you can't think of one without the other. And she paid a price for that. In the 19th century, women were not supposed to sully their head with political speculations. And Abigail was a rule breaker there, as in much else. However, because we have this, just to kind of blow up the Hallmark card image we have of Mrs. Adams, there's a quote. Abigail Adams was many things. She was, like her husband, a Yankee, a Puritan. I mean that in the best sense of the word. That's where I come from. But she had incredibly demanding standards. And the classic example, this is Abigail, who would have 5 children, one of whom would become president of the United States, and one of whom would die an alcoholic. But this is Abigail writing to 11-year-old John Quincy Adams. And talk about planting lifelong seeds of inadequacy in a child, all right? We think of JQA, who's a hero of mine, as this very dyspeptic. Well, he wasn't dyspeptic, he was depressed. And quite frankly, if you'd had Abigail Adams for a mother, you were entitled to be depressed, only because you couldn't meet these standards. Here is lovable national icon Abigail writing to her 11-year-old son. Dear as you are to me, I had much rather you should have found your grave in the ocean you have crossed, or any untimely death crop you in your infant years, rather than see you an immoral profligate or a graceless child. And the problem was she got to define what graceless meant, not the child. Well, but that was the Adams household. And it's extraordinary. JQA, days before he dies, he's had this incredible career. Not only as president, arguably the greatest Secretary of State in American history. And then, of course, that remarkable coda, 17 years in the House, where he single-handedly battles against the gag rule and, for abolition, and eventually inspires Steven Spielberg to make a movie about him. And at the end of his life, he's writing in his diary, which he did all his life, because that's part of being a Puritan in New England, and he says he's a failure. He never improved the gift that God gave him as he should have. Well, that goes back to when you're 11 years old and told that you're a graceless child. The point of that extended ramble was Abigail was a mother. Reading that letter, to me, humanizes her, brings her home, makes her accessible in ways that the more formal, approach. The letters between her and John are deservedly a national treasure. But the letters between her and her children may, in their own way, tell you more about the woman behind the public figure. One other quick thing about Abigail, because it's very touching, I think. The Adamses, it's really interesting, too, because, let's face it, we'll all go home tonight, we'll put on TV or the internet, and we'll be saturated with images of beautiful, shallow people who ostensibly are attracted to one another because they're beautiful and shallow. And the Adamses are the opposite. I mean, John Adams is not a hunk, and Abigail is not a beauty. And yet they clearly had a very sensually successful marriage. Maybe part of it is because they spent as many years apart as they did. But that said, when Abigail died in 1818, John, who would live on another 8 years, said that as heart-wrenching as it was, in some ways, this separation was easier than the earlier separations, when he had left her to manage the farm during the Revolution, or he had put an ocean between them when he had gone diplomatic posts during and after the war, because he knew, even as she lay on her deathbed, that they would be reunited. There was no doubt that one day, he couldn't pick the day, but it wouldn't be long, they would be reunited. And he didn't have that assurance before. That's a love story. And it's another reason why I think the Adams is a special in the American story.
Martha Washington once referred to herself as a state prisoner. What did she mean by that?
Well, she uttered words that sooner or later every First Lady entertains in moments of frustration. Martha Washington, remember, Martha Washington was First Lady before there was a nation to be First Lady of. Just as George Washington was, in effect, the nation's executive before the nation was formalized. For 8 years during the war, Mrs. Washington had enlisted in the cause. You've all seen the images at Valley Forge, and they're true. She became quite beloved by the troops, who dubbed her Lady Washington, which was a kind of the title stuck. It was kind of a compromise. This is a republic. We don't have monarchs. We don't have queens. But we do have, as we all know, anytime a member of the royal family sets foot on American soil, we have something in our DNA that responds. And Mrs. Washington confronted, every bit as much as her husband, the daunting constitutional and very human issue of how democratic is democratic. What is a president? What is a first lady? She understood that she was public property, and that's what she's talking about. She felt that, and Abigail Adams. We think of Abigail as the most outspoken, quotable, sometimes irascible of first ladies, and it's interesting because she writes to friends. She's very aware that everything she says is going to be jotted down and is subject to criticism. I think the sense that you're living on a stage, that you're never able to fully escape the spotlight, that in effect is what Mrs. Washington was saying. And one measure of how successful or unsuccessful a first lady is how you learn to deal with that. And of course, not only how you learn to deal with it, but how your children, who are your extensions, learn to deal with it.
Okay. Some people have suggested that, some historians, that Mrs. Madison may have been the first kind of model first lady. What's your assessment of that?
Well, I can see that. Although I think Martha Washington deserves great credit. She never said a foot wrong. She entertained. Everyone will have their own definition of what is a successful first lady. There is a very understandable inclination, particularly in modern times, say post Eleanor Roosevelt, to define it in essentially public terms and even public advocacy. I mean, can you imagine if we had a first lady who didn't have a cause? Imagine the criticism. And quite frankly, there was a significant degree of criticism directed at Laura Bush because many people thought she wasn't activist enough. All of these rules really can be traced back 200 years. Mrs. Washington every week had a reception called a levee in New York and Philadelphia every Friday night. And every Thursday, the Washingtons had, in effect, a state dinner for members of Congress and others. So she filled that role of the consort and the hostess, which, again, some people condescend to, but which Dolly then professionalized. Dolly Madison, her husband was one of the most cerebral of American presidents. He might have had the highest IQ. He was certainly the most learned in political philosophy. But like some other intellectuals you may know, dare I say, even some academics who you may know, that didn't necessarily coexist with a hail fellow well met or an outgoing personality. She filled that need. 100 years later, Grace Coolidge would perform the same function for her husband, very different from Madison, but equally emotionally constipated. But Dolly took it a step further because Dolly also had a political mind. Dolly seems to, in fact, been the first lady who actively understood and acted upon the understanding that most of the business of government was transacted not on the floor of Congress, nor necessarily in the committee rooms, which were a lot fewer and more modest in those days, but away from Capitol Hill. And it was her stroke of genius to define her role as being, on the one hand, intensely political, and on the other, above partisan politics. She had charm enough. She probably could even succeed in this political climate, which is saying something. She could bring people from the opposite ends of the political spectrum together and make them, for a few minutes, forget why they hated each other. And it was her charisma, her presence. And she had, remember, Thomas Jefferson was a widower. And so Dolly Madison, in effect, functioned for 8 years as Jefferson's White House hostess. Madison was his Secretary of State. So she had, in effect, 16 years. And of course, punctuated by an event 200 years ago this August, which we may or may not observe, when the British burned Washington. And the White House with it. And I'll bet you if you stopped 100 Americans on the street today, they probably couldn't tell you where President Madison was that day in August 1814. Actually, he was off trying to find what passed for an army in the Maryland wilds. But they know, at least vaguely, they know his wife stayed behind until the last minute to save the portrait of George Washington. And that may be one of the first great sort of set pieces of First Lady history. And it's a tough act to follow.
What about the second Mrs. Adams?
Oh, I love Louisa Adams. Well, she was married to John Quincy Adams. And as I just said, I love John JQA, but boy, I couldn't be married to him. And it's a miracle that Louisa was. She was, first of all, she is the only First Lady who was not born on American soil. She was the daughter of a Maryland Tory who moved to London. JQA began his diplomatic career at the age of 14 as the secretary to the American minister to Prussia. Probably even Abigail was impressed. But it will come as no surprise, JQA was also, this is a man who spoke 7 languages, was admitted to Harvard at 15, whose greatest pleasure every morning, he got up before the sun and read Cicero and Tacitus and a book of the Bible every morning, who could write Latin with his left hand and translate Greek with his right. Great party trick. There's probably not many people in Washington today.
You can do that though, right,
Well,
Richard?
well, you know, I want to be modest. But he was, you know, there was something missing. When Louisa lost an infant child, her husband, acting in character, gave her a book on diseases of the mind, which I'm sure offered great consolation. I've often said it is no accident Louisa became a confirmed chocoholic. There are wonderful letters of the First Lady, who was married to the sourest man in Washington, writing these wonderful letters to her friends extolling the medicinal qualities of fudge. And we know from this correspondence that she was a chocolate addict. You know, so you take your, when you're in Adams, you take your pleasures where you can. On top of everything else, she, you know, Abigail, she didn't have a very good relationship with her mother-in-law. Abigail, first of all, I think resented the fact that she was foreign. And I think she looked upon Louisa as too delicate. Here's the remarkable thing. There's a wonderful book, it's been published in the last couple of years. Louisa, on her own, with a couple small children, in the dead of winter, at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, managed to get herself in a variety of carriages from St. Petersburg to Paris to be reunited with her husband. I mean, that would be a mission today. But, you know, it goes to the heart. This woman, you know, she was not too delicate. She didn't particularly care for politics, but she was very much a partner with her husband. When he ran for president in 1824, she had all the necessary parties. On the other hand, when he was defeated for re-election, she thought, at last, you know, we can leave this benighted city and go back to Massachusetts. And they did for about a year. And then there was a huge row. They fought over money. I mean, what do all couples fight over? You know, the Adamses fought over it. It just must have been more eloquent, you know? The abuse must have been much more refined. Probably in Latin and Greek, for all I know. In any event, she was appalled when her husband decided to run for the House of Representatives in 1831. The only president ever to do that to this day. And so she followed him back to Washington and was with him to the end. Really impressive woman. And one of the really moving places in America. If you're ever in the Boston area, carve out a couple hours, go to Quincy. It's only 5 miles from downtown Boston, and see the old house that Abigail secretly had prepared while John was away. And under the church, the Unitarian church, a crypt was carved out of solid granite, which is somehow very appropriate. And the 4 Adamses are buried next to each other. It's an amazing sight to see. I've taken groups on my presidential tours, and invariably, there are people moved to tears.
You mentioned, Richard, that Mrs. Madison essentially played a de facto first lady for Thomas Jefferson. When President Jackson got to Washington, his wife, Rachel, had died shortly before he took office. How did he fill that role?
Well, I don't think he ever did. I think, but it did define his presidency in profound ways. Very quickly, Rachel Jackson was a young woman in a very unhappy marriage to someone who, again, 200 years later, we can't be sure, but he was certainly abusive in the broader sense of the term. They separated. He left her, announced he was getting a divorce. Jackson had come into her life, this young, sort of up-and-coming lawyer, politician, plantation owner, already inclined to have an almost exaggerated courtliness toward women because of what had happened in his own family. As a boy, during the Revolution, his mother had died while nursing the victims of an epidemic. And he fell in love with Rachel, and it was mutual. They got married, and then subsequently, to their horror, discovered that the divorce had never been formalized. Apparently, paperwork had been taken out, but it had never been completed. Okay. The Jacksons never had children, but they were incredibly close. And Rachel became quite religious in her middle age and later years. And Andrew Jackson, and because of that, and Jackson followed in her wake and became terribly protective of her. Well, in 1824, the first time Jackson ran, there was some gossip. But in 1828 is my candidate for the dirtiest election in American history. The Democrats went after John Quincy Adams for profaning the White House by buying a billiard table and using it on the Lord's Day and also being a pimp for the Tsar of Russia. The Adams supporters, not the president, but his supporters, dug up the old story about Rachel. And it was not a happy time for her or him. Anyway, she said she would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord than live in the palace at Washington. And 6 weeks after his triumphant election by a landslide over Adams, just before Christmas, 1828, she suffered a massive heart attack and died. So you can imagine, obviously Jackson was plunged into mourning, but also fury. And no one did fury better than Andrew Jackson. You know, he famously said at the end of his life, on his deathbed, he was asked if he had any regrets. He said, yeah, that I didn't shoot Henry Clay and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun. And I'm sure there was a much longer list, but those were only the most obvious. He blamed his political opponents for killing Rachel. Now, why does that matter? Because his whole first term was consumed with this bizarre, couldn't happen today, scandal surrounding the wife of the Secretary of War, who was from Tennessee, who was an old Jackson crony, and her reputation was somewhat besmirched, apparently deservedly so. In any event, Jackson refused to hear any gossip against her. The cabinet split down the middle. The cabinet wives refused to be in the same room with her. I mean, it would make a great musical, Broadway musical. You can hear the music, you know? And it went on and on and on. And finally, it split Jackson from his vice president, and it contributed to the rise of Martin Van Buren. Van Buren had an advantage. He was a widower. So, you know, he could come to parties with Peggy Eaton, and, you know, no one thought twice except Jackson, who valued his loyalty. In any event, eventually the cabinet was reorganized. Eaton left, Peggy left, but that streak in Jackson's character, that almost exaggerated gallantry, which became politicized as a result of the death of his wife, affected and in some ways limited his presidency.
Okay. Who, of the first 7 first ladies, who do you think had the most lasting impact, historical lasting impact?
Probably Dolly Madison. Well, although I'd say Martha Washington could give her a run for her cupcakes. Aren't they both used to sell, what is it about baked goods and our early first ladies? Because, think of it this way, if Martha had not done as well as she did in an environment where there were no rules and where every day presented an opportunity to go wrong in some way. You know, one thing we know, for example, is she had strong political feelings. She believed that Jefferson had treated her husband very badly, and she made no bones about her preference for Adams as Washington's successor over Jefferson. And yet, you know, we only know that now. She managed to, you know, both the Washingtons, you know, so much for the theory that opposites attract. Not true in the case of George and Martha Washington. The things they have in common are really remarkable, beginning with this instinctive self-discipline, is the only word that comes to mind, plus administrative skill. Remember, before she ever set eyes on George Washington, Martha Custis Dandridge was probably the richest woman in Virginia, and certainly was running the biggest plantation in the state on her own. I mean, running Mount Vernon was in its own way preparation for running a president's household in New York or Philadelphia. Remember, Washington had more people working for him at Mount Vernon than he did in the entire executive branch of government. Things have changed.
We're going to open it up to your questions in just a moment. I have one more question, but Richard, I kind of wanted to ask you an open-ended question. Are there any First Lady stories or historical events that I haven't asked you about today that you'd like to touch upon?
No, I tell you what, let's use the time, we'll give folks in the audience an opportunity. I think before we're done, at some point, I'll talk a little bit about Mrs. Ford.
Okay.
But we'll save that for later.
Okay. All right. We need a couple students out here with microphones. We're ready to go. Who has questions?
Including way back there.
Nobody has questions.
Comments, observations,
Do we have one here? You wanna
constructive
ask a question?
criticisms will be
Okay.
entertained.
Thank you. You started out by giving the number of employees in the First Lady's offices. And
I'll repeat it.
beg your pardon?
No, go ahead.
Okay. And I'd like to know how many are on the White House staff for the current president's wife.
I don't know. I will tell you this, however. The staff has not grown appreciably. It's the same model that in effect was implemented beginning with Mrs. Carter and the legislation that was passed in 1978. It's the functions of the First Lady. I mean, and a lot of it, quite frankly, is almost beyond any First Lady's control. Just as the President has become really part of our extended family. And by that I mean because of first television and now all of these technologies that I don't pretend to understand, the first family is almost an extension of our own. They are, at the very least, always visible. I mean, you go back to Teddy Roosevelt 100 years ago, who in many ways is the first modern president. And part of that was because what then passed for mass media. Remember, before 1900, a president, odds were you probably didn't know what he looked like. You didn't know what his voice sounded like. He was a name in a newspaper. And the presidency itself was seen largely as an administrative position. Under those circumstances, the First Lady was even more obscure. One reason why I personally think it's impossible to play this game of ranking the First Ladies. I mean, how do you compare, Margaret Taylor to Jackie Kennedy? The fact of the matter is the nature of the job. Above all, the media exposure and all that entails. So, for example, modern First Ladies, Mrs. Carter reorganized her office twice in 1 year, 1979, to recognize the fact that part of what she did, for example, the travel that she did, was, in fact, political. And the rest wasn't. And she wanted to keep the two as separate as possible, which I think is a very good idea. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, but, an admirable impulse. Because of the visibility that goes with the position today, because of the demand, because of the mail. I mean, you can just imagine how much greater demands are placed upon anyone in that office. But the most important thing, it's not, in my opinion, it's not the numbers but the functional reorganization that matters. What Mrs. Carter did, and she took a lot of heat for this. Remember, she dared to go to cabinet meetings. Now, my question is, why would anyone want to go to cabinet meetings? Pretty dull, from what I hear. But nevertheless, she went to cabinet meetings. But you see, they'd been partners before they entered politics. They ran that peanut business jointly. And so moving into the White House, it was the most natural thing in the world for her and Jimmy to extend this partnership, albeit into a different realm. Okay. Up until that time, and frankly, a lot of the problems were identified during the Ford years. One reason why this legislation came about was there actually was a study, and it said, you know, we're bordering on dysfunction. The East Wing and the West Wing don't communicate. They are often working at cross purposes. They are often suspicious of, if not hostile, to one another. So the core of the Carter reorganization was not expanding the staff per se, but integrating existing functions. So that, for example, the White House Social Secretary today is a presidential appointee. Whoever it is works for both the president and the first lady. Now that may not sound significant, but you know, for a long time, there was a first lady ghetto, you know, and the Secretary of State and the Chief of Staff didn't feel they had to take seriously what the East Wing had to say to them. That imbalance has been largely corrected. And that's a part of the modern job that no one pays attention to, but it's a significant change.
It's been surmised that Edith.
Wait for a mic, just a second here. Come up here first.
A
Right
mic
here.
for Mike.
A mic for Mike, yes.
It's been surmised that after Woodrow Wilson suffered his health issues and Edith Wilson made executive decisions. What can you say about that? And has there been any other examples where the First Lady actually stepped in and made decisions as president?
First of all, to defend Mrs. Wilson, I once heard a historian, who shall remain nameless, jump at the opportunity to pronounce her the worst First Lady in American history. And he had a whole long list of reasons why. Well, you know, stop and think. Here was a woman who, you know, remember, President Wilson's first wife died a year into their term. He was so distraught that he said at the time he wished someone would assassinate him. Within a year, he had met Edith Bowling Galt, fallen head over heels in love. His advisors did not want them to marry because the 1916 election was going to be close under the best of circumstances, and they were afraid that he would lose the sympathy factor. Anyway, they were married. It was a wonderful, very un-Wilsonian scene on the train the day after their wedding. They were not married in the White House. They were married at her house in Washington. Small ceremony. But the next day, the Secret Service agent who preserved this, thank God, in his papers, the 59-year-old president, Mrs. Galt, was 42. We all think of Woodrow Wilson as this very remote, austere, professorial type. And the Secret Service agent happened to walk into the car of the train, well, he was maybe 20 feet behind the president, who was kicking up his heels as he sang, "Oh, you beautiful doll, you great big beautiful doll," which was presumably not a reference to business of state. And they had this, it's a remarkable marriage, that's all I can say, because it is inseparable from the events of the time, from World War I, from the tragedy of Versailles, the profound disappointments that followed on the League of Nations, and then, of course, he destroyed his health in the battle for the League. She was not the first female president. She didn't come close. And in my opinion, she did not exercise executive function, except what she was the first female chief of staff. She decided who would see the president and who wouldn't. She decided what paperwork would reach the president and what didn't. Those are powerful and potentially historically significant functions, but they're not the presidency. The larger criticism that can be made is his reputation today would be higher than it is had he resigned following, he had a massive stroke in October 1919. And instead, for the next year and a half, the United States functioned really without a president, which I guess showed it can be done, but it wasn't an experiment I think anyone is eager to repeat. They went back, they stayed in Washington, went back to the house on S Street. If you're in D.C., go to the Wilson House, 2340 S Street. It's a 15-minute walk from DuPont Circle. Preserved by Mrs. Wilson, who lived for 37 years after her husband. She died on his 105th birthday. She died the day she was scheduled to dedicate the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, which is probably why it's been jinxed ever since, if you've ever driven the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. But anyway, she wrote a memoir, which is utterly unbelievable. That's her crime against history, is the book she wrote. But it's not, in my opinion. She was trying to save her husband's life. And he was apparently prepared to resign. But the story is the vice president didn't want him to. And there were others who thought that if he did, he would die an early death.
Okay, we have a question here.
Of the first ladies that you've discussed, which left the White House experience with the most damage to their psyche and personality, and which left with the least?
Well, the least was Dolly Madison, who was up for a party every day of her life. Dolly Madison lived until 1849. At the end of her life, she was broke. She had a ne'er-do-well son who spent all their money, so much so that James, on his deathbed, was precluded from carrying out his wish to free his slaves. But Dolly, she became the original Washington Monument. Congress voted her an honorary member, which I don't think it's extended to certainly to any first lady since. She advised later first ladies, and one of the great scenes, in the last weeks of her life, she attended a party at the Polks, which was rare in itself because the Polks were famous for not partying. They were God-fearing Presbyterians, of whom it was said by Sam Houston, the only problem with the Polks was they drank too much water. That would not be said about Dolly. She was one of those life-enhancing figures, Auntie Mame types. So she's the one who left with certainly the least, and in fact, if anything, enhanced, and a legendary figure. I think probably Mrs. Adams, Louisa Adams. I don't think she enjoyed probably a day of their life in the White House. And she was, you know, most first ladies are eager to leave the place at the end of 4 or 8 years. Grateful beyond words for the privilege of having been there, but well aware that it's not a way of life.
Okay. We have a hand over here. If somebody would come over here, Eric, if you'd come over here. Somebody raise your hand here, but go ahead back there.
Hi. The role of First Lady is a role, not a job, obviously. And of all the First Ladies, who in your estimation probably managed to protect her privacy the most of all the First Ladies?
Well, it depends on how you define privacy. I mean, you can hole up in your room, I suppose, and never come out, and I guess you can call that a success. If you're a recluse, God, join a monastery. Don't marry a politician. No, I guess I should say join a nunnery. But certainly, there are first lady. We have no portrait of Margaret Taylor. We don't know what she looked like. Mrs. Zachary Taylor. The rumors, in the absence of seeing her, the rumors were she was a coarse frontierswoman whose greatest pleasure in life was rocking on her front porch, smoking a corncob pipe. Sounds like Mammy Yokum, you know? In fact, we know that that's quite the opposite. But she did nothing to correct that in her lifetime. Mrs. Andrew Johnson was almost as allergic, if you will, to the spotlight. The great tragedy, without a doubt, the saddest, the most tragic figure among all the first ladies is Jane Pierce. She was the daughter of the president of Bowdoin College, who made the mistake of marrying a dashing, handsome, politically ambitious student. She hated politics. When she heard that he had been nominated as a dark horse candidate by the Democrats in 1852, she fainted, which was actually a suitable reaction. The historians have reenacted it often in trying to consider the Pierce presidency. He was truly a dreadful president. In fact, there should be President's Day and an asterisk, except for Franklin Pierce. I mean, it's just, he was bad. Take my word for it. And one reason may have been, he was in an impossible marriage. She had laid the law down. He was the youngest member of the United States Senate. He was offered the attorney generalship of the Polk presidency. Well, not only did he not take the job, but he left the Senate, moved back to New Hampshire. They had 3 children. 2 of them died young. And then, of course, the great tragedy. After Pierce's election, during the campaign, Benny, 11 years old, would write letters to his father saying, "I hope you don't win." Obviously, emulating his mother's wishes and anticipating the historian's assessments. He did win. And between Inauguration Day and, between Election Day and the inauguration, the Pierces were in a train wreck. They were not injured, but Benny was killed in front of them. And Jane Pierce never recovered, and she blamed her husband. Her Calvinist God was punishing them for his presumption in misleading her. He had insisted that he had not actively campaigned for the nomination. And then she found out behind the scenes that he had done exactly that. So she spent basically the 4 years holed up in the White House. She was carried out at the end of his presidency, suffering from tuberculosis. I mean, not a happy time. And you can only hope that history never repeats itself. But that goes to this, to get back to what we were sort of talking about at the beginning. You realize what incredible sacrifices these women made. Many of them, in occupations to which they would certainly never been drawn, and which, frankly, in the 19th century, didn't take them seriously. I mean, they were not active participants in the political process per se, and yet, because of this unique relationship they had, they were incredibly influential with the one man who counted. We all think of Eleanor Roosevelt as being the most influential First Lady, and certainly the first modern First Lady. Among other things, she's the first First Lady to have press conferences, which, by the way, died out as soon as she left. Do you know the first First Lady after Eleanor Roosevelt to have a press conference? Betty Ford. That's quite a gap. Bess Truman, a very private woman, made it very clear she was not going to emulate her predecessor. And it's easy to kind of write her off. Except, if you're talking about influence, there's public influence and there's private influence. And with the presidency, she was one of a handful of people with whom he discussed the decision to drop the A-bomb. That's influence. That's proximity. Mrs. Ford used to say she got a woman on the cabinet through pillow talk, and she was working on the Supreme Court. Time ran out, but I'm sure she's not the first Lady to employ pillow talk. But it goes to this notion. We have to rethink, it seems to me, when we talk about influential First Ladies, I think we just need to be a little bit broader in defining that admittedly elusive term.
Okay, we have a question here.
I have a question about, do you think the history of the First Ladies will give any guidance to whatever we call him, the first guy when we have the female president? That may be sooner than later, but it'll happen one day.
It's just funny. For some reason, it pops in my head. You think that's complicated? God, how'd you like to be in Paris right now? What do you call that? I don't know. Wow. Whatever it is, I suspect the French invented it. If they haven't, they'll take credit for it. Yeah, in a way. I mean, history has value if we pay attention. I mean, it certainly illustrates what not to do. But there will obviously be. Look at how Dennis Thatcher handled himself. Married to a very strong, dynamic female politician, and he was allowed to be himself, and not without controversy, but so I don't know. I mean, I think as usual, forgive me, media, but elements of the media will pay too much attention, and the rest of us will get on with it.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Welcome back, Richard. It's awfully nice to have you here again.
Thank you.
Back where you belong. Richard, I want to run a concept by you and see what you think. About a month ago, I was in the library, And I pulled a book off that, because I was smitten with the idea. It was entitled The Reluctant First Lady. And it dealt with a political couple. It was, by the way, no literary genius wrote this, but it dealt with a political couple that had come up through California first and then up where he was in the Senate before he became president. But all the way through his political career, his wife had maintained a strong career of her own in the arts. And she had been, while he was senator, the curator of a well-known New York museum and kept an apartment there. And no one thought anything about that when he was senator. And she kept telling him throughout the years that even if he became president, she did not intend to fulfill the traditional role of First Lady. She was going to keep her career. And supposedly she thought he fully understood this. Well, the night he's elected, after he gives his victory speech, a reporter says to her, "Are you going to push the cause of art then as your thing as First Lady?" She said, "Oh no, I'm going back and be the curator of this museum, and I will not serve that traditional role that is nothing but a figurehead." And so I understand since then that Laura Bush had made this statement once. She could foresee this happening, that some First Lady with a very successful career of her own will not give it up. And of course, it throws his whole political group into crisis mode because it splits the country on who thinks that's a good idea and who thinks it isn't. But it is interesting. It's true. Does she make the sacrifice and give up her very successful career?
The only thing where I guess I would take exception is at this late date to regard the job as merely a figurehead. It's as much as you want it to be. Mrs. Ford discovered in a very personal way, less than a month after moving into the White House, as you know, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and had surgery. And the family gathered in the hospital room and they had a discussion. You know, how open are we going to be about this? And as far as she was concerned, I don't think there was ever any question. But if you can cast your minds back 40 years, breast cancer was not a subject that was openly discussed, with untold consequences for American women and their families. And Mrs. Ford overnight broke that barrier. And she said she was astonished. By the time she left the hospital, a few days later, you know, she flipped on the radio and heard that all over America, thousands of women, inspired by her example, were making appointments to see their doctors to get examinations and mammograms. And it dawned on her the incredible potential power for good that a First Lady has. So I'm not saying you weigh that against the satisfactions that anyone can derive from a profession that you love and you're good at. What I'm saying is it's a mistake for anyone at this point in time to I think, look upon this job as merely ceremonial or lacking in, to be bipartisan, totally bipartisan. Laura Bush may have had greater impact abroad than she did at home, between PEPFAR in Africa, which is basically a $5 billion American campaign to combat AIDS in Africa, and being an outspoken advocate of the rights of women in Afghanistan, and implicitly throughout the Islamic world. Do you think she would have had that platform as the wife of the governor of Texas, or as a librarian, as much as she enjoyed, you know? And then Mrs. Obama, in terms of the day-to-day impact of her advocacy for military families, and her championing of healthier diets, particularly for young people. Again, you know, we don't have in this culture many disinterested, semi-royal advocates, people who we respect, people who we listen to until there's some reason for us not to think that, you know, they're pulling one over us or practicing politics by another name. And in this culture that is so polarized and is much more inclined to point fingers than to clasp hands, the role of the First Lady arguably is more important than ever.
Okay, we have a question here.
Yes, I have just finished reading Margaret Truman's book on First Ladies, and in it she mentions quite often her feeling of the press and how the press doesn't always treat the First Ladies very complimentary. And I wondered how you feel about
Well,
that.
that is a complaint as old as the Republic, which suggests there's something to it. On the other hand, you know, the press is part of the same culture as the rest of us. Jackie Kennedy, before November 1963, was enshrined in popular memory, not for any legislation she promoted or any political position she took. She didn't take any. She was enshrined in the popular culture, first of all, for her restoration of the White House. 65 million Americans watched her televised tour in 1962. Can you imagine getting 65 million people to watch anything today, including the Olympics? She was enshrined for style, dare I say, not substance in the political sense of the term. And yet, for most people of a certain age, she has an indelible imprint on the collective memory, obviously made permanent because of the pictures, television. I mean, she's a television. He was the first television president. She was the first television first lady. And I think that's a significant part. Now, the irony is television is also, at least for the next 50 years, seems to be changing, was also the chief means by which most Americans got their news. And it was not always kind. Pat Nixon actually restored more of the White House, actually collected more historic furnishings for the old house than anyone else. Mrs. Nixon began floodlighting the White House at night because she thought it was so beautiful, people should be able to enjoy it around the clock. Mrs. Nixon began tours for blind visitors to the White House. I mean, there's a whole host of things, but you never heard about it. you heard about Plastic Pat. You know? I guess the light side of the moon. He was the dark side. I tell you what, though, let me close with one story that I guarantee you won't hear anywhere else. And I'll let you speculate on how many First Lady stories like this there might be out there. Several years ago, I was invited by the White House Historical Association to do an oral history, to interview all the surviving White House social secretaries, of whom there were 14 at the time, and do it all on tape, average of 2 to 3 hours per social secretary, beginning with Letitia Baldridge, who was Mrs. Kennedy's first social secretary, and going right up through Laura Bush's. And at one point, we flew to Kentucky to talk to a woman named Lucy Winchester, who held the job for Pat Nixon. And I started by saying, you know, that I thought Mrs. Nixon had not really gotten the recognition she deserved, and so on, historically or at the time. And I remember saying, was she as shy as she appeared? And she said, no, she wasn't shy. She was self-effacing. And there is a difference between the two. But anyway, then she proceeded to tell me this story, which illustrated Mrs. Nixon's sense of humor, which I guarantee you didn't know existed. This was very early in the administration, and the president had just come back from his trip to Europe. He'd gone over mostly to see de Gaulle. And he came back, and as Lucy said, two of the bad guys from the West Wing, you know, there's so many to choose from, I'll let you speculate. But anyway, came back clutching what they thought was the acme of sophistication, which they had bought in some dive in Paris, which was a blow-up doll, a female, anatomically correct blow-up doll. Anyway, Mrs. Nixon found out about this. The next day, the White House was to be visited by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Several thousand members of the Daughters of the American Revolution. An ocean of blue hair descending on the White House. And I should take that back. They're very nice people. Anyway, so Mrs. Nixon, the wheel started turning. The president had run into the first president. Here's trivia. Who knows who was the first president general of the Daughters of the American Revolution? Mrs. Benjamin Harrison. Anyway, the president had run into the president general at an event in Washington, and very expansively said, oh, listen, don't just come to see the public rooms. Come upstairs, you know, and we'll show you, we'll show you around the private quarters. So Mrs. Nixon and her social secretary hatched this idea. So they have to get the blow-up doll blown up, they send it over to the carpenter's office in the White House, who must have wondered what the hell was going on. A request from the First Lady to blow up this doll, you know? So they blow up the doll. Cut to the second floor elevator, opens up, and out of the elevator walks Mrs. Nixon and her social secretary holding the hands of this blow-up doll, walking down the corridor while they decide what would be the most effective place to stash this doll. And so they try a couple rooms, and then Mrs. Nixon, no, I got it. So they put the blow-up doll in the tub in the Queen's room. And Mrs. Nixon said, gee, I hope they don't think it's me. We don't know. Unfortunately, I don't know what the president's reaction was. But it tells you that Mrs. Nixon had a very well-developed sense of humor, which must have been tested severely many times.
We have time for one last question right back here.
Was there a Mrs. Millard Fillmore, and what do you know about her?
There was a Mrs. Millard Fillmore, and she's actually a very impressive woman. Her name's Abigail. She was a school teacher. In fact, some people say she was the first working woman to be First Lady. Among her students was Millard Fillmore. And she was, by all accounts, impressive. She installed the White House Library, which, when you stop to think about it, is appropriate. She was consulted regularly by her husband about political affairs, the most important being the Compromise of 1850, which effectively forestalled the coming of civil war for 10 years. She advised him to approve it. And, the theory that no good deed goes unrewarded. He was not nominated by his party in 1852. The electorate turned to the aforementioned Franklin Pierce. The Pierce inauguration, foreshadowing the Pierce presidency, was a dismal affair with a cold rain. Mrs. Fillmore caught cold, turned pneumonia, and she died within the month. She made the ultimate sacrifice. But, I'm glad you asked that, because there's someone who probably most of you have never heard of. And in fact, she led a very interesting life in her own right. Had she never met Millard Fillmore, but she demonstrably contributed to and enriched the Fillmore presidency. And sooner or later, I think you could say that of every single one of these women. Everyone has served her country to the best of her abilities. And for that, if for nothing else, they deserve better than textbook obscurity.
Okay. Richard, thanks a lot for a great program.
Sure.
Thank you all for coming out today. Tomorrow night we start at 7. We'll get started at 7 sharp because it's live TV. So get here early tomorrow night. Get a good seat. Thank you all for coming.